There's an old legend that says that after the death and resurrection of Jesus, his mother Mary would often walk the way her son had walked on his journey to the cross, pausing here and there to recall something that had happened at that spot. From these walks grew the early Christian practice of walking the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross in Jerusalem, a tradition that continues to this day. The practice was really expanded in the Middle Ages during the Crusades, when crusaders made their way to Jerusalem and started to try to revisit these historical places, experience, in some ways, not only the scripture, but the legend of Christ's journey. And when they came home from their crusades, they wanted to give the people at home an opportunity to have a similar experience to strengthen their faith. And so stations have ranged from as few as 5 to as many as 30. The stations have fixed now really on 14 or 15, and they typically invite a way to experience Christ's journey. What's very interesting is that the original Via Dolorosa was probably shorter than 500 yards, but now, because of the way the city of Jerusalem has grown up, it could be more than 2 or 3 miles, going up and down hills because buildings have grown in the way of the old straight way out of the city where Christ was crucified, just outside of the old gates. Now we know that Jesus' own journey did not take place down some sacred street. His journey was on a regular street. And each step, each cobblestone was filled with a divine presence in the act. And so in these sheets that follow, the art was made by Illustrated Children's Ministry and has been partially colored in by our children and parishioners before COVID-19 prevented us from being completely together and finishing. We have an opportunity to reflect in some different ways on Jesus' journey and our own. Station number 1 is called Sorrow, and here we visit Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And you'll see many, many tears in this picture, and I happen to remember exactly where I was on the morning of September 11th, 2001. It was actually my second day of graduate school at Emory, and it was 30 minutes before the beginning of my very first class, and all classes, of course, were halted for the day, and we got to see all kinds of footage and outcry, and Billy Graham said something like, "The lesson of the event is not only about the mystery of iniquity and evil, but it's a lesson of our need for one another. A tragedy like this could have torn our country apart, but instead it has offered the opportunity to unite us." And so we encounter at the first station in the garden Jesus in his moment of sorrow and pain, but he is not alone. He is with the disciples. And although we tend to give them a bad rap for falling asleep 3 times, it's worth noting that they were at least present. You might consider how many tears are shown in this picture. You might consider moments that were earth-shattering for you, and consider who was with you, who reached out to you in your need, both in the moment and afterward. When have you faced a crisis and needed to turn to others for support or prayer? How did it make you feel to have to rely on them? Brene Brown says that we tend to have a very hard time receiving, which means we tend to have a hard time giving. If it's difficult for us to receive, we usually judge those to whom we give as needing help and ourselves as not. So I wonder if it isn't worth pausing at a moment of sorrow to think about the gifts people have given us, even the imperfect ones, and how we might receive those joyfully, and how we might reach out to one another as we contemplate Christ, lonely perhaps, but not alone in the Garden of Gethsemane. Someone once said that the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. And so it was with Jesus and with Judas. The scriptures point out he was one of the 12. He may have even been the treasurer. He could have been one of the most influential members of all. We don't exactly know why Judas betrayed Jesus. Some say it was because it was part of God's preordained plan. Others think it's because he was hungry for power and control. Some think he wanted more money for himself. Others think he was disenfranchised with who Jesus himself wanted to be instead of who he had planned for Jesus to be. And still others think that Judas was trying to force Jesus' hand to be the king Judas had hoped he would want to be. Regardless of why, here is the moment in which Jesus is betrayed by one of his friends, and through a sign of friendship. Kissing one another in greeting was not for strangers, but for intimate members of a family or a circle of friends. And so here we get to reflect not only on the hurt of Jesus, but on our own lives. When have you used your position of trust to betray someone close to you? Have you been let down by a close friend or family member? And how did you deal with your feelings? How were you able to set new boundaries, or to love again, or to get up from falling down? I invite you to journey with Jesus at his moment of betrayal by looking inwardly to your own. At the third station, we consider the condemnation of Jesus. And it's helpful to pause and remember that it was not evil people necessarily that rallied for Christ's crucifixion. They may have been very well intended, and they passed false judgment. It's worthy to remember that Pilate is painted by the Gospels as trying to get Jesus off of the hook, but being somehow coerced and forced by the crowd. There was an amazing display in the High Museum in Atlanta called the Innocence Project, in which it depicted the photographs of people accused for capital crimes and who were sent to jail for those crimes, and then the photo after DNA evidence was used of the actual perpetrator. And so some of these falsely accused so-called criminals spent years in prison. And when the photos were viewed side to side, they actually look very little like each other, except in general the common characteristic was they were both black. And so we're invited to consider, as Jesus is falsely condemned for being a king that he had no interest in being, when have we been guilty of condemning someone based on our prejudice or on circumstances? Have we ever hid behind the veneer of our own religious beliefs in an attempt to justify our prejudice? And have we ever ourselves suffered the sin of false accusation because of how we look or because of neat and tidy circumstances? Jesus invites our contemplation of our judgment, our bias, and our prejudice today. As we consider one of Jesus' better friends, Peter's denial, not just one time, but 3 times of Jesus, it's maybe worth pausing to wonder if Peter could have offered testimony that would have freed Jesus. It's worth pausing to consider if there was anything that Peter could have done for his friend, not only to free him from the kangaroo court that he faced, but also to be in solidarity with him. And Peter invites us to consider in his moment of denial our own fear, and if we have possibly stepped back from friends in moments of fear or anxiety and left them to fates that they did not deserve. Has there ever been a time you have denied your faith, your belief in Jesus, your love in a friend, in order to fit in? Have you experienced God's forgiveness after thinking you'd done something that was unforgivable? Here, as we think about denial, we're invited, I think, to consider what Brene Brown offers as the difference between fitting in and belonging. Of course, fitting in is when you have to be according to what other people say, and belonging is when you get to be who you are. Consider Peter's denial of Jesus and your own story of fitting in or belonging as you walk the road of faith. At the 5th station, we consider judgment. We consider Pilate, who has been kept up possibly all night. His wife was tormented by dreams. We consider he was in a place he didn't want to be, with people he didn't particularly care for. We consider all of the fingers that pointed at Jesus in judgment, trying to get what they wanted, instead of considering the depths of his humanity and whether or not he indeed even fit the bill. Today we're offered the opportunity to consider how we point at one another's instead of offering a hand up to them. Today we're offered to consider with Jesus whether we might focus more on loving others rather than judging them. We might also consider if there are concrete actions we could take to love someone whom others think is unlovable. Again, Brene Brown says that people are a lot harder to hate up close. And so our invitation as we consider the misjudgment applied to Jesus perhaps is, how could we get closer? How could we have more appreciation for others who we find ourselves biased, angry at, or just all too easy to write off? How could we grow closer to others and open our hand instead of pointing the finger? There's a contemporary icon called the Madonna of the Holocaust, which shows Mary dressed in the clothes of an early 20th century Eastern European Jewish woman holding Jesus on her lap. They're surrounded by barbed wire and the names of horrific places like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Birkenau, and Auschwitz. There's a large yellow Star of David sewn into Mary's clothes and a dove in Jesus' hands. The imagery used in this icon is a stark reminder that both Jesus and Mary were Jews, and had they been living in Hitler's world, they would have been forced into a concentration camp, not just because of their faith, but because of their own biology and their ethnicity. And so here we get to see, at the 6th station where Jesus is crowned, agents of the state forcing Jesus to wear a crown of thorns and a purple robe to mock him as quote-unquote king of the Jews. Christians have sadly used this as an excuse for anti-Semitism and the mistreatment of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And of course, in the scene, we know that the Romans had no interest in the kingship of Jesus. Rather, they were trying to show him, to flatten him, to poison the well of Jewish faith and custom and religion, of Jewish hope. And we're invited, as we consider the crowning of Jesus, to consider, is it strange to think of Jesus as a Jew rather than as a Christian? What implications might the crowning of Jesus have for our relationships with people of other faiths, be they Jewish, Muslim, Catholic, Mormon, Hindu? And do we sometimes crown people who believe differently than us in a way to flatten or mock them instead of appreciate how it is that they came to the beliefs that they have arrived at? At the 8th station, we consider Jesus bearing his cross, picking up the consequences that he neither earned nor deserved, but were forced upon him by the state, by anger, by hatred, by prejudice and bias. Christians have argued for centuries about whether or not Jesus had to die and on the necessary meaning of his death. But Christians have always agreed that his solitary decision to take up the cross has changed the course of history and had eternal consequences for all of humanity, that his death was for us, and that his willingness to bear pain, to bear a burden on behalf of others for us, has changed the world. This change has had cosmic consequences and has invited people and represented people, whether they were firefighters, EMS workers, police officers, and people working in soup kitchens and food pantries, or volunteering in prisons, to carry the cross of indignation, to go against some of their own fears and their worries, to suffer on behalf of others in an act of selfless love. And every act of selfless love has cosmic consequences. As we consider Jesus bearing the cross for us, we pause to consider the crosses others have also borne for us, selfless acts of love that have helped carry us where we are. We pause for gratitude. And we pause also with the opportunity to consider those acts of selfless love we've done for our spouses, our siblings, our children, our co-workers, and to give thanks to God that every small act of cosmic love changes the world. Let us journey at Station 7 not only in gratitude for Jesus, but in gratitude to help bear the crosses of the world, to give life to others. At Station 8, we consider helping, in which Simon of Cyrene is compelled to force carry the cross. Tradition says that Simon will bring Christianity through his children Alex and Rufus to the entire continent of Africa. Simon had little choice what he would do in this moment, and oddly enough, his association with Jesus would change not only his lives and the lives of his children, but an entire continent. We're invited to consider how our example of kindness has changed the children, the mentees, the junior associates in our lives. How might it change the way we helped people if every time we extended a helping hand to someone, we imagined them as a child, and that their testimony could change the world if we could just offer them a hand up, an extra shoulder on their burden? Maybe it's liberating to think we don't have to always feel like doing it, as Simon may not have, in order for it to work. Who has taken your burdens, willingly or unwillingly? Who has enabled you to continue on your journey because they were willing to help you walk? And how have you done that, and how can you do that for others? That is the message of Station 8. Station 9, we consider the women of Jerusalem who met Jesus on his way as they were crying. They were sad because they knew Jesus was a good person and did not deserve to die. And even though he was in incredible pain himself, Jesus made room for them. He stopped to comfort them and to bless them. And we're invited to consider how in the midst of our pain we might still make room for others. We're invited to consider, as we see others making the way of the cross, how we might support them instead of take even more life from them. We're also invited to consider what it means to bless one another, and if the best blessings even have to have words. We might consider which blessings have been most meaningful in our lives, whether they are ones from ministers or ones that have our hands here in the gesture of the Trinity that has been so influential in the Christian tradition, or whether they've been hands up or arms around shoulders or pats on the back. We're invited to care for the women of Jerusalem as we walk, no matter how hard it is, and we're invited to care for one another as the women did for Jesus on his road to Calvary. The image of the cross has become so commonplace as we look at Station 10, where Jesus is crucified, that we tend to forget how truly revolutionary it is and was. In 1949, the communist regime in Poland began work on Nowa Huta, a new town just north of Krakow. In an effort to crush the Christian spirit of the Polish people and to reinforce the atheism of the Communist Party, the government decreed that there would be no church building in Nowa Huta. It was the first Polish city to be intentionally designed without a church. But the people's faith could not so easily be destroyed. They erected a large cross in the middle of the field where they wanted their church to be built. Each time they would put the cross up, the communists would bulldoze it down, and there's a minor miracle that continued to happen that every time the bulldozer came and left, not one new cross would take its place, but 10, 30, 50, even 100 crosses would take its place. Finally, after this happened, for almost 20 years, the communists issued a permit for a church to be built. They saw over and over again that the Polish people would not acquiesce to their bulldozers. And that church stands still today. John Paul II, a Polish man himself, dedicated the new church himself a year before becoming Pope. Jesus came to teach us about God's love. Jesus wanted to listen to him and follow his way. Some people did not like what Jesus was teaching them, and so they decided to crucify him on the cross. But even on the cross, Jesus continued to teach us about God's love. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The cross, then, has not been about a symbol of traditional triumph, but of determination, of a willingness to face unfair consequences as a protest against oppression and as a call for life to others. Could you imagine a time when you might use the cross as a sign of protest against oppression? Can you imagine a time when you might be willing to bear a cross on behalf of others? Can you remember a time when somebody has stuck their neck out, embraced the cross for the sake of your life, and be grateful not only for Jesus back then, but in your own life and walk? There were two criminals crucified alongside Jesus on the day he died. One of them made fun of Jesus. Perhaps both of them did, but at some point, one of them knew Jesus had done nothing wrong. Because the man was a criminal, he thought maybe God didn't love him. But Jesus loved the man very much, and even in his moment of pain, promised him that he would be with God and God would be with him forever. Jesus promised that criminal that today he would be with Jesus in paradise, in a garden. What do you think about the idea that paradise might begin here and now? Here was a man who had earned a criminal justice for the crimes he'd committed, and Jesus is willing to offer him not only another chance, but the assurance of God's love. Who in your life might need a chance, a second chance, or who might you need a second chance from? Could you join God in offering people in the middle of the consequences they've earned the assurance that they are not forgotten or alone? Could you be with somebody even when they're being punished? How might it change the way you practice your faith to believe that we don't have to wait until we die in order to be in paradise with Jesus and bring others there with us? At Station 12, we once again meet Jesus' care. Jesus taught us that we are all part of God's family. When he was dying on the cross, he asked his friend John to take care of his mother Mary, and he asked his mother Mary to treat John like she would her own son. Even when Jesus was dying, he wanted to show us how to love and care for one another. What are some ways, as you think about Jesus' care for his mother and for his friend, that you could show another person you care for them? Have you ever thought about the person in your school or your church or the person you work with as members of your family and made new families to include those who may not have the families we enjoy? How might the relationships with people in our church or our school or our roadways change if we were able to think about them as members of our family and try to heal broken families when we find them? At Station 13, we consider the darkness as Jesus dies upon the cross. In Mark's Gospel, the veil in the temple is ripped from top to bottom, a veil that separated priests from the presence of God. Jesus worshipped at that Jerusalem temple many times when he was alive. When Jesus died, oddly enough, the curtain was torn in two as it became dark throughout the city. Of course, we've understood that to mean we can now always be in God's presence without others to stand before us, that there is immediate access to God. We're offered to consider how we might bring God's immediate access to people sitting in the shadow of darkness in our world. How can we bring God's sunshine to those who are sitting in the dark? How might we deal with our fear of the dark, whether literal or spiritual or emotional or mental? Can you think of someone who has braved the darkness to be with you, to offer you a hand and a heart and love? Can you think of a time when you've overcome your fear to help someone else and bring them closer to God? Especially in darkness, we're offered to consider the false curtains we erect that separate us from God, and to consider how we might join God in tearing them down and bringing others into God's full presence. Station 14, Jesus is buried by a man who may not have known him very well. Joseph of Arimathea had a new tomb that no one had ever laid in. It was to be a tomb for his entire family and only for his closest family members. He asked Pilate if he could take Jesus' body down from the cross. And so Joseph hastily prepared Jesus' body for burial and put someone not in his family in his own family's tomb, the first. Joseph does what is fundamental to the human tradition. He cares for the dead body of Jesus. Human is based in the Latin word humare, which means to bury their dead, to look after those who have died. Our funeral rituals of the church teach us about the dignity of the human body. They offer us the opportunity to grieve those who we see no longer while commending them to God. Our humanity teaches us to respect bodies after death, as Joseph did. We're invited to consider not only how we care for the dead, but how we might care for the living today. We're invited to consider how we might make room to give others dignity and care in their greatest moments of sorrow. How we might make space for them, even in the lives of our families, in the middle of pain and despair. And at the 15th station, not always included in the stations of the cross we walk during Holy Week, we're considered to offer the new life and a new beginning. And the hope of walking the stations is not only that our story might resonate with Jesus's and his with ours, but that we might, like him, experience a new beginning, a new way of walking in our own lives and our own shoes of faith, and with those who we know intimately and those we're meeting for the first time. How can the stations of Jesus guide us to a deeper experience of humanity, compassion, empathy, and care? Jesus is not in the place of the dead. He has been raised. And let us join in Jesus' experience in raising those who others have written off, whether those people be ourselves, our families, our friends, or even perfect strangers. Alleluia, he is risen indeed.